Joining us now is North Dakota Republican Senator Kevin Cramer. Senator, thanks so much for your time tonight.
Thank you, Lindsay. Looking forward to it.
So, of course, we'd like to talk to you about voting rights. Since the 2020 election, according to the nonpartisan Brennan Center, there have been at least 34 new restrictive voting laws in 19 states. They've ranged from reducing polling place availability, limiting early voting hours, shortening deadlines to deliver mail ballots, to a whole slew of other restrictions. You've called the Democrats' attempts to pass election reform a, quote, fake crisis. So since you don't think this is a house on fire moment, why do you think that so many states are moving to restrict how Americans vote?
Well, first of all, Lindsay, states aren't restricting. In fact, the much vilified Georgia, where the president went yesterday to try to make his point, is a great example. Georgia's new bill mandates 17 days of early voting with 2 optional Sundays, which is, by the way, more. That's 2 plus 2 more days than the Democrats' bill does. So it is a fake crisis. In fact, the last election had the largest turnout, the largest minority turnout of any election. In fact, recent elections have been demonstrating that self-governance is working very well in the United States. But states, let's not forget, are in charge of their own elections as per our great tradition of self-governance and a federal government created by the states, not the other way around. States are looking for ways to secure the ballot as they open up more days to vote, as vote by mail becomes more popular. And let's not forget that's happening in both Republican and Democratic states. It's important to apply the security measures to vote by mail as well. So frankly, I think Joe Biden is the captain of a sinking ship, and he's trying to divert attention away from that sinking ship. And it's unfortunate because we're sitting here in a border crisis, a runaway inflation crisis, frankly, a national security challenge, unlike anything we've seen in recent decades. And he's monkeying around, threatening to blow up the United States Senate over a fake crisis called, voting rights.
Well, I do want to just go back to the idea that you were saying that they're not restrictive. I mean, in many cases, they're eliminating the number of ballot boxes. In many cases, they're saying, no, you have to produce a photo ID in order to vote. So there are some restrictions, right, which by definition would make them more restrictive.
Well, they're not restrictive. What they are is they're secure. So you brought up requiring a voter ID or a picture ID to vote. Well, gee, I mean, I have now in Washington, D.C. next week, I have to show my vaccine pass to eat. If that's not restrictive, I don't know what is. And yet somehow, not having to prove you are eligible to vote in order to cast a vote, I think is crazy. In fact, one of the areas of great dispute has to do with the increased voting by mail without having to prove you are who the ballot says you are. And I just don't think that that's an unrealistic expectation at a time when people are questioning, the validity to vote. So absolutely, I just don't.
Well, why? I mean, like in Georgia, for example, it's not even legal to give food and water to voters in line. I mean, why? Who does that benefit?
It's not legal for political operatives to give people food and water. By the way, that's a law in many Democratic states today. Before this, that was a law in many Democratic states. We don't want political operatives giving people water in the line, that says vote for candidate D. But that's up to states. That's not even a federal issue. States run elections, not the federal government.
And as you're well aware, Senator, President Biden does want the Senate to carve out an exception in the filibuster to help get 2 voting rights bills to the finish line. Is there anything in the 2 bills under consideration that Republicans would support, that you personally would support?
Well, is there any one thing in these bills? I've seen so many things I couldn't begin to support that I've not looked at every little thing to see what I might be able to vote for. But this attempt at blowing up the integrity of the United States Senate, something that he said he'd never do, by the way, as have several other Democratic leaders, including several senators, including Chuck Schumer, to carve it out in the legislative calendar for this one thing that seems to me to be an attempt to transform elections, federalize elections, turn the FEC into a partisan commission. All of that is designed so that they can tilt the scales in their way. And what they ought to be doing is dealing with the crisis that is runaway inflation. that is a crisis at our border, that is China, that is Russia, 100,000 troops at the Ukraine border. Those are the things that people expect the president to deal with, not these fake crises called voting rights, when there really is not a voting rights problem in our country.
Sure. That is your perspective on that. I am curious, just when we're looking at some of the small line items there, For the People Act, for example, makes Election Day a national holiday. Would you support that?
Yeah, absolutely not. I mean, that's just plain silly. We've been running successful elections without it being a national holiday for over 200 years. And now when you want to, it's part of this debate is over how many days should elections be, making one of them, or would we make it a week? Would we make it a month? Well, no, we don't need a federal holiday. I do support, not necessarily federal legislation, but I appreciate when employers, for example, both encourage and facilitate their employees' ability to vote. But now, when when we have dozens of days for voting, I don't see why you need a federal holiday.
Your colleague, Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, has agreed the Electoral Count Act, which dates all the way back to 1887, might need reform. That's the obscure rule which nearly set the stage for the Vice President Pence to overturn the will of the American people after the 2020 election. Is this an area that you would work with Democrats on?
I'm interested in it. I'd be interested in hearing some thoughts about that. The nice thing is that even with all the upheaval of January 6th, the vice president didn't do that. And I think because the Constitution is quite clear about it, Lindsay, sometimes we need to pass laws that clarify what I think is the obvious intent of the founders. Shouldn't need to be clarified. But yeah, I'd be open to clarifying that so that, as much as anything, so that the American public has a clear understanding of what the Constitution says is a responsibility of the vice president and, of course, the members of Congress who simply oversee the counting of the ballots that come to us from states where they're supposed to come from.
If Senate Democrats carve out an exception in the filibuster for this, when Republicans at some point in the future do take control of the Senate again, would you support doing the same thing to get through Republican priorities?
Well, let's not forget, just a couple of years ago, a year ago, we had that opportunity, or 3 years ago, we had that opportunity when we had a majority of the House and the Senate and the presidency. Our president at the time, President Trump, urged us to do exactly that. And Republicans stood up against that change and said, no, the integrity of our legislative process, the integrity of the United States Senate is too important to do that. I was in the House at the time that we had a majority in both the House and the Senate and the presidency. And as tempting as that was, Republicans resisted, and we would expect that our friends on the other side of the aisle would do the same this time.
But you did get rid of it for Supreme Court nominees, though.
Well, let's not forget that was Harry Reid started that process with what's called the other calendar, if you will, the appointments to various positions. But he started it with the circuit courts, and it now applies to the executive calendar and across the board, with some safeguards still in place for the minority. But now you're talking about the legislative calendar. That is a much, much different deal. In fact, previous to Chuck Schumer coming to the United States Senate, the executive calendar never filibustered. Clarence Thomas wasn't even filibustered. And so that tradition changed when Chuck Schumer got into the Senate. And that's why I think, having seen all of that, it's all the more important that we make sure that the legislative calendar does not go the way of the executive calendar.
Senator Cramer, we thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate the academic discussion here.
Always my pleasure, Lindsay. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.